My name is Jim Copeland, and it's James Edwin Copeland Jr. formally, but everybody who knows me would refer to me as Jim. I'm retired CEO of Deloitte in the U.S. and global, held the two positions simultaneously. And I spent 37 years with that firm. As I mentioned to you earlier, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the notion of focusing on singular leadership. I think, particularly in the environment that I grew up in, leadership is very much team sport. And in a professional services firm, you have relatively small teams of people who serve clients, and the leaders in those teams are the most basic element of leadership in the organization. So when you look at it broadly, with 100,000 people, you literally must have thousands of people that are leading more or less in the same direction if you're going to accomplish anything strategically. So the notion of giving all the credit or all the blame to a single leader in an organization, at least in a professional service environment, I think is kind of ludicrous. But there's a role for leadership. But people talk about the tone at the top, and I would say that's a necessary but insufficient condition for creating a tone in an organization or a culture in an organization. And I think the real test of that is the tone at the bottom of the organization. You could have St. Peter as the CEO of your organization, unless the people in the firm would buy into his values and into his aspirations for the organization, you wouldn't have the culture that you're looking for. Your notion of accountable leadership has a lot of appeal to me, and probably because of the environment that I grew up in professionally. Professional service firms are by nature sort of a model of accountability, because they by and large are partnerships, and the leaders in general, and certainly at Deloitte, are elected by the partners. And so you have to be accountable to that electorate every year. I know at Deloitte we had a group of partners every year that would be asked to go out and interview as many of the partners as they could, and literally would do hundreds of interviews. And they would come back with what the partners had said about the leadership of the firm. And then they would sit down with you for about 2 miserable days, telling you all of the things that the partners had said about your performance over the past year. And it was enormously frustrating, because they didn't try to harmonize what they heard. And so you would have one partner saying, Jim's spending too much of our money investing in the long term. And other people would say exactly the opposite. They would say, Jim's not investing enough in the long-term future of the firm. And you would sit there and look for more feedback or some kind of reconciliation of those views, and they would just stare back at you. So it was frustrating in that sense, but it was really good input to get. It was valuable input, because you did know that there were people out there with both of those points of view. And the message that communicated about accountability was just incredible. You were working for them, and they had expectations of you, and they expected you to perform up to those expectations. And that there was no way to escape that being right in front of your mind when you had to go through that every year. So from an accountability standpoint, I was fascinated by the organization that you're leading, and the subject and direction that you're following in your research.
So how did you find yourself arriving at Deloitte?
Mm.
I mean, after 37 years ago or more,
yeah.
You arrived.
Yeah, the lead up to all of that. I grew up in a very small rural town, Norcross, Georgia, which now is, of course, a suburb of Atlanta. But at the time, it was dirt roads and small schools, and the phone book had about 8 pages in it. About 400 people in the town in total, and I was born into a family with 3 children. I had a wonderful mother and dad. My father was a world-class athlete. Obviously, the genes skipped a generation, but he was a wonderful athlete, and his sense of competitiveness sort of permeated the family. I know I finished, I think it was 3rd in the state in the half mile, and that was known as losing. so it was a pretty competitive environment to grow up in. When I was about 4, I contracted rheumatic fever and heart disease, and so I was in a wheelchair for 3 years, I guess. And parents were told I was going to die. I was told I was going to die. God had other plans, and came out the other end pretty much, physically diminished. But fortunately, I grew up in as I said, in a small town with small schools, and so I was able to play sports, and I was able to. If you could stand up and chew chewing gum, you could make any team that was there. So I had an opportunity to play all of the sports, and as a small town, small school athlete, I did just fine, and so I was had an unrealistic expectation of my athletic abilities as I went into college, and I started college at Oglethorpe University, which at that point had a wonderful basketball program. They lost the year before in the quarterfinals of the national tournament to Southern Illinois, who had a wonderful team, and had an all-pro who was playing point guard for them at the time, and so. I stepped into that environment and found out how high I couldn't jump and how quick I was not, and had a lot of disappointment to deal with in that first year. Transferred to Georgia State a year later, figuring that I had better get an education if I wasn't going to be able to be the professional athlete that I had aspired to be. And started in actuarial science because I thought actuaries made a lot of money, and found out that they made a lot of money for good reason. You had to be really, really good at mathematics to do well there, and found out I was studying till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and going to class and listening to people who had done the homework that I had spent all night doing. They had done while they were playing bridge, and it struck me I was going to have to compete with those people for the rest of my life, and that probably wasn't a real good place to be. So I decided I better get somewhere else. Tried management for a while, and that just seemed like common sense. Took one accounting course. Hated it, just hated it. Actually got into accounting because I hated it so much. If that makes sense. They had an experimental course that they were offering as the second basic course in accounting. And I thought anything had to be better than the first course I had been through. And they had a professor who was on loan from Arthur Andersen, who was a partner at Arthur Andersen. He ended up as the head of the quantitative methods department at Georgia State. And he taught the accounting course in an entirely different way. And there was business games and gaming theory and lots of interesting notions. And he encouraged me to major in accounting. And I said, you can understand, I hated, the first course. And he said, well, the profession is nothing like what you have, been through in that first course in accounting. So you need to really think about this. You could do okay in that environment. And so I took his advice and majored in accounting and did okay through the curriculum. And I thought it would be a good foundation to have and a good way to sort of prepare for whatever you ultimately decided you wanted to really do. And the public accounting firms were recruiting when I graduated, and they expressed some interest in me. And again, I thought if I could get a CPA certificate, it would be a nice thing to have as background and could lead you to do a lot of things. And ended up attracted to Deloitte and took a position with them. At that point in time, it was pretty much an apprenticeship arrangement. When you went into public accounting, it didn't pay you very much money at all. You worked for 2 years for very little money, got your CPA certificate, and then if they wanted to keep you, they increased your pay to sort of a reasonable level, and if not, you went on to the next thing that you were going to do. And unlike a lot of people who were disenchanted with their first year in public accounting, I loved it. It was enormous variety. You'd be in a bank 1 week, 2 weeks, and then the next week you'd be working in an airplane factory. And I had not had a whole lot of exposure to business other than loading lumber in a lumber yard. And so all of this was, just eye-opening for me. And I really enjoyed it. I like working with a lot of other young professionals. And for the 37 years I stayed with Deloitte, that was the thing that really attracted me most, was the opportunity to continually work with bright, capable, high-character people. And every year you would bring in a new class of bright, bushy-tailed people who were just as smart, if not smarter, than the partners in the firm. And so you had this sort of sense of refreshing that went on in the organization. And to this day, many of my very best friends are friends that I developed through my career. I took a sort of a traditional career path in public accounting with Deloitte. I was in the audit practice, and I served some of our largest clients, and I'd been doing that for 7 or 8 years, and the managing partner of the office came to me and said that they were going to start a small business services practice, which was a service line focused on entrepreneurial kinds of companies that would be venture capital supported and sort of the next big clients for the firm. And I had been getting an itch to try some managerial ideas. I didn't think that our firm was particularly well managed, and I thought we were being sort of run off the playing field from a competitive standpoint. And I had some ideas I wanted to try, and so this was an opportunity to exercise some of those ideas and see if I could make anything happen. And I got calls from all over the country from friends who said, "Have you lost your mind? You're serving the largest clients in your office, and if you just keep your nose clean for another couple of years, you'll be a partner, be admitted to the firm, and be home free." And but doing the same thing for another couple of years just didn't really have very much appeal to me. I've always been kind of intellectually restless, and in fact, one of the reasons that I retired early was that the opportunity to do even the top job in the firm for another 4 or 5 years, just I'd been there, done that, didn't have a tremendous amount of appeal. So I had no problem taking the opportunity up, and I spent the next several years building that department, and it was fairly successful. And after a couple of years, I made partner in that role. Largely doing it by surrounding myself with really exceptional people. Although I didn't have an advanced degree, I had an undergraduate degree. Everybody I brought into the department had a master's degree, and they were very high talented people, or I didn't bring them into the group. And so as I say, I made partner in that department, leading that department. And the firm put us through a group of tests, psychological tests and things like that. And then we had a debriefing after that was over. And this was after we had made partner, so we wouldn't panic as being a threshold test or something. And the psychologist said, "You say that you might have some interest someday in managing the firm or being in a firm leadership position." And I said, "Yes, sure." And he said, "But yet you say what you really enjoy doing is creating small groups of really talented people to accomplish aggressive, exciting goals." And I said, "Yes, that's right." And he said, well, that profile sounds more like a commando leader than it does the general of an army. He said, and Deloitte's got 30,000 people in the United States. It's an army. This is not a commando unit. He said the great generals find a way to make the average person in the organization a little bit better. He said, the great leaders of large numbers of people find ways to be successful, more successful than their competitors with the same kind of people, with average people. And that really struck home with me, and I recognized that was a valid criticism. And I don't know if it's true or not, but the story is that Napoleon's great success criteria was that he was able to train his soldiers to march a little faster than the standard for European armies. And so despite all of the conversations about his great marshals and everything else, there are people that believe that his success is really attributable to training his troops to a higher standard. And that story really stuck with me as well. And I have had, for that reason, a lifelong sense that a part of your responsibility as a leader of a large organization was to make the team better, and that you made the team better by training to a higher standard. And I think those two things, which I got really from education within the firm, had an enormous impact on me. I remember to this day going to new senior accountant school, which is after you've been with the firm for 3 years. And there was a professor from Temple there who was our instructor. And he said, I don't remember anything else he said, but he said that no organization exceeds the expectations of its leadership. And that sort of wove in well with the other things that were sort of an important part of my concept of leadership, was that leaders had to have a high expectation of the organization. If you didn't have, they weren't going to overachieve your expectations, and so you needed to set high goals for yourself in the organization. Leading public accounting firms, law firms, things like that, really a different kind of leadership role, because you are leading a group of people who, on average, are very, very talented, very, very smart, very, very talented. And a command and control structure doesn't work very well because they have options. And I always said, when I was partner in charge, and quoted the Atlanta office, I said that's a misnomer, because the talented people are the ones that are in charge. They can choose to vote with their feet the next day, walk into another organization, get a job tomorrow, and you can't replace them. So in a professional service environment, you have to find ways to show a confluence of interest between the organization and the individual. And if you can show the individual how doing what you want them to do for the organization will benefit not just the organization, but will also benefit them, you're dealing with smart people. That makes sense to them, and you can lead that way. And one of the best places I always thought to learn to do that was in nonprofit organizations in the community. I started volunteering with United Way and places like that because I thought we, as an organization, should be giving something back to the community. I'd been brought up that way, and I thought that was important. And after a couple of years, I concluded that I was the one that was really benefiting, because I was learning how to lead people that I had no ability to command. I didn't pay any of them. I didn't hire or fire any of them. So the only way that I could lead in that organization was, again, to create a confluence of interest between United Way, for example, or Woodruff Arts Society, or whatever the organization was. Show a confluence of interest between that organization and the individuals that you were trying to lead. So that turned out to be just a great training ground, not just for me, but for the other people in the organization. About 1980, I was asked to become the managing partner of the Atlanta office, and I was 37 years old. We had a bunch of other really young partners in the office, and we didn't have a clue of how to do what we just been assigned to do. And so we just started trying to figure it out together. And we started, and that's where my ideas about multiple leaders and team leadership began to form, because it was obvious to me that people up and down in the organization were having a profound influence on our success, and it certainly wasn't all coming from me. And we had the opportunity to learn from each other, figure it out as we went along. When I took over, we were like number 10 in the Big Eight in Atlanta. We were really small, and there were a couple of local firms even that were larger than we were. 3 years later, that had really changed, and we were number 3 in the city at that point. And more importantly, everybody was having fun, and we were really enjoying coming to work. We were out recruiting the larger firms in the marketplace because we were creating this kind of fun environment, I think, to work in. And we decided we didn't want to lose that. We said, we're not exactly sure, what we got here, but we sure do like it. And so we started trying to write down what we referred to as mission values, our mission, vision, and values statement, and sort of what we aspired our working environment to be. And we were convinced that you could create the working environment that you wanted. And in fact, if you didn't, you kind of got whatever developed, and it was accidental, and it needed to be intentional. So our notion was that that if you had parts of your working environment you liked, you really needed to recognize what they were, and you needed to protect it. And to the extent that there were things that you didn't like, you could change that, but you had to do it intentionally. You had to decide what you wanted the work environment to be, and then get on with doing it. And so we put pencil to paper, and some of it was aspirational. It wasn't all, as you can imagine, no work environment's perfect. So there were pieces of it that we needed to change and wanted to change and got committed to change. And that really got a lot of traction across the firm. And so that statement of mission, vision, and values sort of became the basis for the cultural statement that for Deloitte over a period of years. Other offices picked up the same document, worked with it, modified it slightly, and then over time that became sort of a foundation for the cultural development of our firm. And so we were really excited about that. As the office became more successful, I got moved into a regional managing partner's role and became responsible for the Southeast, basically, and ultimately a vice chairman in the firm. And then in 1984, despite the progress that we had made, it was clear that there weren't going to be 8 survivors among the Big Eight. And so we concluded that we needed to do a merger, and Pricewaterhouse came and knocked on the door and suggested that we do a merger with them. And that was my first real involvement with high-level national and international strategic activities. And we tried to work through the merger with that firm. It was approved in the United States, and it was vetoed by Pricewaterhouse in the UK. And so the merger fell apart. Pricewaterhouse was clearly the more dominant of the 2 partners at that in that proposed merger at that point in time. And so we were in kind of a mess. We just had a failed merger, been sort of rejected by the other firm in the UK, and we changed our leader globally and in the U.S. And had a new Mike Cook, who was my predecessor in the U.S. firm, became the CEO at that point. We did a strategic plan. We changed our board. We changed our management committee. I became a member of both of those at that stage, and we really went to work on trying to become a lot more competitive than we had been in the past. And we had good success with that in the United States. We did not have particularly good success with that globally. And in 1989, our UK partners came over and very politely put a gun to our head and said that they were a very prominent firm in the UK, and said that if we needed to do a merger, or else they were going to have to seek another association with a different firm. There would be no replacement firm in the UK, so nothing even remotely close to what to our firm there. So we really felt we had no choice, and strategically we had been moving in that direction anyway. So we agreed to go into that process, and we settled on a merger with Touche Ross. The business press referred to that culturally as the merger of Madonna and Jimmy, or the marriage of Madonna and Jimmy Stewart. Deloitte was the Jimmy Stewart, Touche Ross was the Madonna part of the combination, and it was a culturally different organization. Happily, both firms, I think, recognized that the other firm had something they needed. Deloitte clearly recognized we needed more aggressiveness and a little more street smarts than we had demonstrated in times past. And I think Touche Ross felt like that they needed the association with the large, sophisticated clients and the experience and history that Deloitte had in serving them. So, despite the difference in culture, the merger was enormously successful over time. The integration was not. We attempted to. We lost our UK firm, although they wanted a merger. They had a firm in mind, and it wasn't Touche Ross. And so when we announced that we were going to do the merger with them, they had intended from the first for us to merge with Coopers & Lybrand, and so they merged with Coopers & Lybrand. So we ended up losing one of our two firms in the UK, in the Netherlands, in New Zealand, or not New Zealand, in Australia, and a couple of other places, prominent places. So it was not a good start for the merger, but business is a relative game. You don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the other campers. And so even though we didn't execute that merger perfectly, strategically it was a really, really wise thing to have done, and over time it made us into a tremendously powerful firm. And, if you ask me today, I would say that Deloitte is the largest professional service firm in the world. If you ask somebody from PricewaterhouseCoopers, they'd probably say they are. It's a really close comparison today. But it's amazing to me still that we had the number 7 and number 8 firm in an industry merge and emerge as the number 1 or number 2 firm in the industry. I don't know if that's ever been done before in history, so it turned out to be, a very good thing for us. From a leadership standpoint, it did offer some challenges because of the cultural differences I mentioned earlier. It was also in any merger, there are just enormous tensions between the cultures of the two groups, the interests of the two groups. You don't have the history of trust and experience that you have in an organization where you've grown up for 20 or 30 years. So being able to lead in that environment, lead both groups of partners in that environment was a tricky thing. And at the end of the day, trust turned out to be the turning point. You had to create an environment where your partners, from no matter what their heritage was, from either Deloitte or Touche, you had to You had to have an environment that people would trust. And we went through 5 years of merger integration, and coming out of that, our two leaders, one from either firm, had sort of shared the responsibilities of leadership, had worn thin with the partners, because they had to make a lot of hard decisions. I'm sure partners from both sides wondered if their leader had properly, represented their interest in the combination, and a lot of difficult decisions to be made. We did it right in the middle of a recession, so there was a lot of downsizing that occurred. People had to be fired. People had to be released, and that creates hard feelings. And so their ability to be reelected was called into question. And so I was approached by our nominating committee of partners, and they said, we're not sure that we can elect your two current leaders, and would you consider running with another partner as an opposing slate? And I said, absolutely not. That we're too fragile as an organization, and if we have a contested election at this stage, it's likely to tear the firm apart. And I said I would not do that. And they said, okay. So they went away for a month, did some more interviews, came back and said, can't be elected. They said, said, if you won't run against them, would you run with them? Never even occurred to me. We had two leaders, now we're going to have three. But that turned out to be the answer. And so I ended up part of a three-man office of the chief executive. I was the managing partner, elected managing partner of the U.S. firm. The other two members of the office of the chief executive had different responsibilities. One for our major clients and our public persona, and another for our international activities. And so and each of us reported separately to the board of directors. If that sounds like a difficult managerial involvement, it was. And there were lots of places where you rubbed up against each other, and probably not the ideal solution to have the unity of command doctrine violated that comprehensively. But we got through whatever difficulties we had. We got through those, and the firm was in fact successful over that 5-year period of time. For me, it was an exciting time. Had opportunities to try things and do things that we'd not had before. I introduced our first strategic plan to the partners, and at that point in time, there was a concept around professional service firms, and it was known as the glass ceiling. And the notion was that professional service firms could only make so much money. That at some point, the business model just didn't work, and you couldn't get beyond that point. And we were roughly there. I thought that was absolute nonsense. And so my strategic plan suggested that we would double our partner earnings over that average partner earnings over that 5-year period. And they laughed out loud at the partners meeting when I put that up on the screen. You got 2,000 people out there, and I put the anticipated result from our strategies up on the screen, and they literally laughed out loud. But they liked the idea, so we worked at it, and we hit our strategic our earnings goal in 4 years. So they were happy with that. I'd like to take a lot of credit for that, but it was really in that wonderful period of time in the market when we were sort of leading up to the tech bubble, and if you were a public accounting firm and you had people you didn't have to do much selling. You just had to open the doors, and it was before the year 2000, so all the consultants were busy putting in new enterprise-wide systems. You had opportunities with new, rapidly growing companies because of the tech boom. And the real key to growth was your human resource practices, and we had really focused on that as a key strategy. So what we had done was we'd started with my predecessor's idea that we needed to understand and fix whatever was causing our firm not to be able to promote women partners. And I mean, we were bewildered by it. We'd been hiring 50% women for years and years and years. And yet when you got down to the promotion to partner time, there weren't any women left. It wasn't that the process of partner selection was biased, because there weren't any women there to choose from. And so what happened was, even though there was a very small difference in the turnover rate among men and women over a 10-year period, when you carried it out over that 10-year period, you had to understand for men it was like 10% a year. So there were only 10 left out of 100 when you got to the 10th year. And so with a small difference for women that was worse, you ended up with virtually no women left in the management pool after 10 years. And there were lots and lots of reasons for that. But to make a long story short, most of the reasons were human resource reasons. They weren't female reasons. They weren't gender issues. They were people issues. And so we focused on that hard, and we said, okay, we got a chance here not just to make things better for our women in the organization, but we have a chance here to make things better for our people in the organization, and maybe to create a competitive advantage with our competitors. Public accounting had probably the worst reputation for churn and burn of talented people that anything in business. And we said, let's turn that around. Let's see if we can turn that around and become a real magnet for talented people. We were able to significantly reduce our turnover rate among men and women. So we started to be able to make women partners. We were able to attract and retain more talented people in the organization. And then when the economy took off, and we needed to attract even more people, we were able to go to the other firms. And we had positive switching statistics against every one of our competitors in terms of partners. And our least successful comparison was a 2-to-1 advantage. So we took 2 partners from them from every 1 partner they took. Our most successful was 10-to-1, where we took 10 partners of theirs for every 1 they took from us. And so in a growing economy, that was an enormous competitive advantage, not because we were good salesmen, but because we actually had people to staff work. And so when a potential client came in, we had people to do the work. And so we had 1 year in which we grew. This was a 100-year-old firm, and we grew 30%. So in a mature industry, having a growth rate of 30% is just phenomenal. I wouldn't particularly want to go through that again, because it was a little like holding on to the back of a roller coaster as you were trying to recruit enough people and hire enough people, qualified people to do the work. But that was an exciting time. And again, with all due credit to the economy, we had 5 successful years, and at the end of that 5 years, I was then elected CEO of the U.S. firm and also of the global firm in that would have been 1999. There, one of the big objectives was to try to find a way to consolidate or to integrate the practices around the world. Public accounting firms do not own their affiliated organizations in other countries. It's not like a corporate organization where you would buy your subsidiary in France or in Japan, but rather it's more like a franchise where the individual countries are very, very strong franchisees, and they're very, very strong because there really are no substitutes for them. So if Deloitte, for example, were to lose the Tomatsu firm in Japan, there's really no other substitute for that firm. So while you theoretically can take the name down from the door from the franchisee, you don't have anybody else's door to put it up on. So it creates a very, very strong franchisee relationship with the global organization. So you have to accomplish those things by influence. You have when I was CEO of the global organization, I couldn't fire a secretary in France. It was, you had to ask that things were done, and again, find ways where the interest of the national practice coincided with the interest of the global firm. And that usually had to do with clients. If you were in Germany and you had a first-rate client that you wanted served, that had subsidiaries in the United States and you wanted it well served, then you had best take care of the U.S. clients that had subsidiaries in Germany. So there was a strong reason for us to cooperate, but there was also a strong sense of national sovereignty, and the idea that we would create a global management team and a global governance vehicle, and that national sovereignty would actually be transferred to the global organization was not an easy sell, and about the only way to do that was face-to-face with creating a level of trust in the global leadership. And that meant putting yourself in an airplane and traveling about 75% of the time and living with jet lag. Most of my meetings were a day or two, and then you were back on an airplane going somewhere else and in a different time zone. And so I just concluded I was never going to feel good as long as I was in that job. And you don't realize how bad you're feeling until you get out of the job and aren't constantly jet lagged. But that was the first big assignment, was to sort of try and bring the disparate pieces of the global Deloitte organization into a common strategy, into a common management approach, create as much of a one firm feeling and execution as you could, while still maintaining the sovereignty of those national practices, and also not exposing the national practices to the U.S. tort system, which was very important to those folks. So they did not want to be in the U.S. justice system. I think every global CEO, I always said, and Deloitte has believed that they led the firm during the most difficult time in its history. And they're all right, because things have just gotten progressively worse and more difficult. And I guess for me, there were two or three really particularly difficult periods of time. And one was September the 11th. And we had already, the other coinciding difficult thing was the accounting scandals that were taking place at that point in time. And it reminds you a little bit of today with the politicization of the investment bankers and the bankers that that we're seeing in Senate hearings and things like that. I had a wonderful opportunity to testify before the Senate Banking Committee. You saw politicians being very, very critical of people in our profession. And you had September 11th happening, right in the middle of all of that. and I knew the character of the people in the organization that I was privileged to lead, and I thought that it was a shame and a disgrace to have them castigated by politicians. And so, against all the advice from our public relations firm, which said, keep your head down, be quiet, don't say anything, I felt like my job was to defend our people. And I was bound and determined to do that. And the PR guys were right in the sense that it was like spitting into the wind. It was this enormous political backlash against the profession, just because there were a lot of accounting scandals at that point, and it was very difficult to make any headway in the press or in interviews and things like that. But I was determined to try to do it, and so I have no idea how many interviews I did, or trying to defend the people in not just in our firm, but in the profession. About that time, of course, September 11 happens, and we had been in our New York office had been in the World Trade Towers at the time of the first bombing, and our people had walked down 100 floors in pitch black, smoke-filled stairwells. And they weren't going back. So we moved our New York offices into, unfortunately not very far, into the World Financial Center, which was sort of across a couple of streets from the World Trade Tower. And we were there when the terrorist attack occurred. And I talked about the culture of our organization, how much we had worked on that, and our human resource focus of our strategies. And after those people, first of all, it destroyed our offices in the World Financial Center, glass blown in, things like that. But by that point, we had better emergency plans, and so all of our people got out fine there. And they walked the couple of miles, I guess, up to our Midtown office, covered in soot and ashes and everything else from the collapse of the building, and worked for as long as 48 hours straight on the telephone, trying to be sure that all of our colleagues were accounted for. I was on voicemail daily during that period of time with the people in the organization, and we still have 70 people in the organization unaccounted for. We still have 25 people in the organization still unaccounted for, because we knew we had client service teams in the World Trade Tower. And we didn't know all of the Deloitte people that were in the New York area, because, again, people came in from all over the world to New York to work on their own clients. And so it took literally days for us to finally figure out that we had lost one person's life in the World Trade Towers. But again, I was so proud of our people. That what they did that day. One of our guys in our Connecticut office, in our one of our technical areas, was a retired staff sergeant in the Marine Corps. And he put his uniform on and found a way to get back down into Ground Zero. You may have seen the movie. And this was the point at which they pulled out all the first responders, because they were afraid the other buildings were going to collapse. The towers had already fallen. They thought the other buildings around them were going to collapse. And he talked a New York police lieutenant into going back into Ground Zero with him. And they went in looking for survivors. And they found a little cave that had been created by the falling of girders. And it was about 18 inches of hole there. and they found 3 people that were trapped in the hole. One or two of the people were caught under the girder. And so they dug their way into that hole and worked for 6 hours, trying to cut everybody loose. And they got two people out alive, and one person subsequently died. But they saved 2 people's lives. And I would do interviews after that, and I would say, these are the kind of people that I work with, and these are the kind of people that politicians are questioning their character. And I said, I can't stand it. So it's just this is the stuff that these people are made out of, and they deserve more. They deserve more respect than they're receiving. So that was an interesting time to be leading the organization. We were talking earlier about how leadership is dispersed, and that 9/11 experience was a great example of that. I was actually in Nashville the day that the trade towers were struck. I was about to go to Tulsa. I was waiting in the airport, and the flight was delayed. And I said, "Well, why is the flight delayed?" And they said, "Well, a building's been hit by an airplane." And I said, "Well, gee, they must have had good aim if they hit a building in Tulsa." And they said, "No, the World Trade Center's been hit by a plane." And my first thought was terrorist attack. My second thought was, thank God we got out of that building. And then, obviously got on the phone, started trying to get to people in the office, and we had some of our partners who were there and already stepping up to the leadership job of being sure that our people were accounted for. We had one partner who just on his own made a decision to buy 800 cell phones, and we probably owe that that man more than we'll ever know, because that was the only way we really had to communicate with the 3,000 people that we had in the World Financial Center at that point in time. They had to go home. We had to find ways to communicate with them, and those 800 cell phones were just a godsend at that point. So there's a guy, in the midst of a crisis that does exactly what he knows he ought to do. Doesn't worry about whether he's going to can get reimbursed or not. He's making the right decision, doing the right thing for the organization, and that's the kind of leadership up and down the organization that is required for an organization to really be successful. And we had tons of people like that were practice unit leaders that took care of their people, that got them organized, that found a way to make them productive again in a short period of time. So in a period of 2 weeks, we were at about 95% of capacity again. And again, really, really wonderful leadership from people on the ground. Shortly after that, Anderson collapses as a result of the problems they were having with the Justice Department. And I had known Joe Berardino, who was the CEO of Anderson, quite well, and I liked Joe, and we had conversations before about potential merger, and we danced around each other. Neither one of us really wanted to merge our firms. I'd been through it before and didn't want to go through it again, and Joe wanted Anderson to be independent, but we both liked the other firm, and so we finally put our cards on the table and said, "Look, I don't really want to do a merger, but if anything happens and you're about to do a merger, or we're about to do a merger, we ought to talk." And so we agreed we'd do that. And so in the midst of these scandals and everything else, I get a phone call from Joe, and he says, "Jim, it looks like we may have to do something." He said, "This problem that we're encountering is not going away, and it looks like we're going to have to do something." And I said, "Well, we'd be happy to talk with you." So we spent a week in a hotel in in New York with about half the lawyers in the Western world, I think, trying to figure out a way for us to do a global merger with Anderson without having the liability that they were dragging transferred to our firm. And we struggled with that, and even at one point, you may recall that Paul Volcker was the sort of independent oversight person that was working with Anderson to try and help them through this difficult period. And Joe and I called Paul and said, we're talking about doing a global merger. And I said, I really don't think that's good public policy. We've only got 5 firms now, and if we merge with them, there'll only be 4. And I said, I think that's really not the best answer. I said, if it would be possible for you and Arthur Levitt, for example, who was then the head of the SEC, to go to Congress and create a safe harbor for Anderson, I said, we will withdraw from these conversations because we really don't think this is a great idea. But otherwise, we're gonna move ahead. And Mr. Volcker said that politically impossible. He said at this point there's just no way. And so we went ahead with the conversation, tried to make it happen, and just couldn't get in. Even Anderson's lawyers finally agreed that there was no way to affect this transaction globally without carrying a lot of potential for carrying the liability through. So decided we couldn't do that, so we had to attempt to negotiate mergers in every country around the world. And so we were reasonably successful with that. We ended up merging, I think, in 20 different countries, and pretty much split Anderson between Ernst & Young and Deloitte. I think Pricewaterhouse merged in China, and maybe KPMG in Australia, I think, but and maybe a couple of other countries. But in the main, the Anderson firm was divided between Deloitte and Ernst & Young. And it has been a terrific combination for Deloitte, I assume for the other firms as well. But for our firm, it solved a lot of problems in specific countries where we didn't have the strength that we really needed to have, and we got an enormous number of talented people as a part of that combination as well. And it was just a bloody shame that a great firm like that, even when the courts overturned the verdict, of course, that was a Pyrrhic victory because they were already gone. But it was a sad thing for the profession. I think a sad thing for the public in many respects, but a great thing for Deloitte retrospectively. So again, it was an interesting period of time, interesting several years. The opportunity for re-election comes up, and I'm looking at whether I want to do the same thing for another several years, and for a lot of different reasons. My health was not good. I was not tolerating the travel particularly well. I had very young grandchildren, and I was really excited about watching them grow up. The sameness of the job had very little appeal to me. It's just I'm always 4 or 5 years I'm ready to move on to the next thing, and throughout my career with Deloitte, they were great about that. The people would say, "How many different jobs have you had?" And I'd say, "Well, probably 15 or 20." And I said, "But it's all with the same company." I've done, I've had lots of opportunities to do different things, but always within Deloitte. And for the first time, there was really nothing left for me to do within Deloitte. So they talked with me about perhaps doing the chairman's job and splitting the chairman and CEO role. And I said that would make two people miserable, me and my successor, because he would be worried about changing things with me sitting there, and I would be worried about him changing all of my perfect decisions. So he can't. It's just not going to be a good situation for either one of us. So, concluded we wouldn't do that, and I would go find other things to do. And the firm has been blessed with a lot of great leaders in the organization. It's been wonderful to see them perform since I left. It sort of reconfirmed my own lack of confidence in my own abilities relative to the people that I was working with. They've done a marvelous job. And I went about sort of figuring out what I was going to do with the rest of my life, and I took a position, an unpaid position, I should say, with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as a senior fellow for corporate governance. I was really interested in board matters. I took 4 corporate board positions with Coca-Cola Enterprises and Time Warner Cable and ConocoPhillips and Equifax. So that kept me off the streets. I had a couple of nonprofit boards. One in Atlanta was Voices for Georgia's Children. This was a startup advocacy organization for children's interest in the Atlanta area, and it was being fostered by United Way. So they asked me if I would help that organization get started. I didn't know anything about public policy issues, but I did know something about getting organizations started. So I served as chairman of that organization for 4 or 5 years, and then on the board for another couple of years. And then it was time for people who knew what they were talking about. They needed someone who understood public policy. And I worked for years with and still am on the board of the American Friends of the Pelopeppa Train, which is a clinic on rails that serves the remote regions of South Africa from a healthcare standpoint. And they have an eye clinic on the train. They have a dispensary on the train. They have doctors and nurses on the train. And I made the mistake of going over there while I was still with the firm and going out to visit the train. And people had walked for miles and miles and slept all night under the train so they could get their only access to health care in the course of a couple of years, because the train makes a cycle through the various regions of South Africa on a once every 2-year basis. And so this was the only health care that those people, the older people particularly, had access to. And it was just heartbreaking. So I was hooked at that point, and helped to raise money for some period of time with for that organization in New York. So when I announced my retirement, they said, "We want you to come over and we want you to tour South Africa." we had people we're gonna take with you, and so I went over there out of politeness as much as anything. And the first night we stayed in Johannesburg, and we had a suite that consumed the entire top floor of the hotel. I mean, it was unbelievable. And there was we had a butler who stayed in the room. And I mean, it was totally uncomfortable for me, but he just stood there in the room, and just constantly upbeat and happy, and so what are you going to do this morning, Mr. Copeland? I said, we're going to go out and visit this thing called the Pelopeppa Health Train, and he said, I take my grandmother there every year. He said, I go out and collect her and her friends, and drive to wherever the train is going to be, and they get access to health care. And from that moment on, there was nothing I could do that he wasn't involved in, that he didn't want to do for us. So when I saw the way that the people there were reacting to that service, and the limited budget that they had. It was like $2 million a year was their total cost for doctors and drugs and everything else that they provided. So we started doing an annual dinner in New York, and we raised about $500,000 a year in that exercise. And I'm still on the board. I'm no longer the chairman. I ask, one of the things you discover as you retire is that as you get older, so does your Rolodex. And so the people that you're calling, that you would normally pick up the phone and call for contributions, are now retired also. So it was well past time for somebody else to take on that role. But I still enjoy my association with that organization because I know it does a lot of good. I was also at Georgia State as a global scholar, what they call a global scholar, and I kind of do whatever they ask me to do. I typically will do a few lectures a year for an MBA course or class, and have great affection for the school. We're slowly but surely funding a chair there between the firm and Patricia and I. Managing to find enough. I'm teaching a Sunday school class again, which was great. I did that for about 20 years before I moved to New York, and with the travel requirements there, I really couldn't teach for the 9 or 10 years I was there, and so it was great to get back and start teaching the Bible again. I hadn't done that, and had missed doing that. So teaching a small couples class now, that takes a little time and thought. Having a great time with my grandkids. It's a wonderful decision to spend a few years with them while still had decent health. So as I look back on it, I really have no regrets at all about the decision to retire early. Wouldn't take anything for the experience, but think I had the timing of exiting just about right. Well, and again, very few things that were pure gender, but they were things that impacted more heavily on women than men because women are still principally the caregivers at home. So we not having flexible work arrangements, for example, was really difficult for we would lose extraordinary talent because we were unwilling to do anything other than the 70-hour a week during the peak seasons of work, and so which is really stupid because you couldn't replace people that had great knowledge, great expertise. So we started saying, okay, we're going to find a way to make this work, and so we would have people that were working part-time. And that got some traction, but the thing that we did that really caused that to work was we made a couple of partners who were working on a part-time basis. And man, that went through the organization like you could not believe. There were issues around, it was not a big issue, but there were occasional issues of sexual harassment, and those had to be dealt with. We had when I was, I guess it was when I was managing partner, one of our partners was involved in inappropriate behavior. We disciplined him, allowed him to continue to work, and there was a second instance. And this was a guy who was one of the most productive partners in the firm. He was, at that point in time, if you were producing $25 million of revenue a year as a partner, generating those kinds of revenues, responsible for them, that was a big deal. And he was doing that. And he was also personal acquaintance of mine and had worked with me. And so when all of that popped up, the question of what are we going to do now comes up, and we fired him. And that went, of course you can't announce something like that. You don't say, well, so-and-so was involved in sexual harassment, now we fired him. You can't do that. But it didn't matter. That went through the organization, in about a nanosecond. And that did more to establish the fact that we were serious about, men and women as colleagues, as we referred to it, than anything else I can think of. So there were a lot of things like that. Flexibility in work, making the work environment less hostile for both men and women. We had always talked about doing extraordinary things for our clients, and so we began to talk about doing extraordinary things for our people who do extraordinary things for our clients. And I know it sounds kind of hokey and trite, but we really did that. And so we tried to do if somebody made an exceptional effort around serving a client, they had a registration statement or something like that that required, working all night for a couple of nights to make it successful. We tried to do something extraordinary for them as well. And so they had the sense that it wasn't an unbalanced equation, that we really were interested in our people. Promotion of women was really important. Women had to see that they had real potential to advance. And we also discovered, and this was a gender specific thing, but it would have been true of men as well, that they needed a critical mass environment. So if you had a single woman in a tax department, her chances of success were not very good at all. But if she were one of 5, her chances went way up. She had role models, she had support groups, she had people were accustomed to working with women, and that we didn't know. So that was a new learning, and we became sensitive to the fact that our women felt that our women had a very different view of the working environment than our men had, and including some of the few women partners who had been able to survive all of this. They spoke rather plainly about the working environment, and the guys were just shocked. Sensitive bunch of men, and it was like hitting us in the face with a fish. But we made great progress, and I give my predecessor much credit for having focused on that and having led us to initiate that right in the teeth of merger integration and a recession and everything else. And I kind of wanted to take it to the next level. So my objective was to go from women in the firm to women as leaders in the firm. And so what I wanted to do was to find ways to foster women leadership and female leadership in the firm. And I was really pleased when I retired. The chairman that was elected was Sharon Allen, who is now finishing her second term as chairman of Deloitte, and I think the only female chairman of a major professional service firm. And terrific leader, just absolutely a terrific leader. So there were a lot of things that we had to change. A few of them were gender specific, and but most of them were things that that affected everybody, but just simply affected women more heavily because they were playing 2 roles, both the caregiver at home and also the professional at work. I think the thing that surprised us was that there were not more gender-specific things. And we started off thinking they were all going home when they quit, that they were all going home to raise kids or something. And I mean, we brain dead. And what we found out was, we did a little basic research. We found out that they were leaving, but they were leaving to go to work somewhere else. They weren't leaving to go home and take care of the family. They were going somewhere else. And so, boy, that really hurt. So we said, we really have to think about how we change the environment, because we were hiring 50% women. So we had to make an argument to the partners about why to do this, because a partnership is not the birthplace of political correctness. Let me tell you, you need a good, hard-nosed business reason to do something and convince the partners to do something. And what we finally settled on was we said, look, 50 years ago, we hired 100 men, and 10 years later, we promoted the 10 best men to partner. He said, now we're hiring 50 men and 50 women, and 10 years later, we're promoting the 10 best men to partner. So we are diluting our gene pool. We are degrading the quality of the partnership, and that sold. They understood that. It was numeric. They could figure it out. We were taking the best 1 out of 5 instead of the best 1 out of 10. And so we said, okay, we got to fix this. We can't degrade the gene pool. We have to find a way to deal with that. And so as soon as they understood it in practical business terms, then the deal was sold, and we got really good buy-in from the partners. But to try and sell it on the notion that it's politically correct would have been a disaster. But they understood the business case, and that was the reason, I think, for the initiative's success. And then, of course, once you get critical mass, it takes care of itself. They work with them. They're dependent on them in teams, on each other in teams, and it began to take on a life of its own. Except in that boom period I was talking about, when we were growing at 30% a year, all of a sudden our statistics began to look worse. We had been tracking these diversity statistics, and had been looking great, better every year, and then all of a sudden they started looking worse. And I'm sitting there scratching my head, and I'm asking everybody, what's the reason? And they said, well, it just doesn't make sense. We're hiring the same number of, if you look at the number of women we're adding and the number of men we're adding, it's okay. The turnover ratio from year to year isn't changing. I said, wait a minute, time out. This is a mathematical equation. I said, it has to be in our advanced hiring, where we're out on the experienced hires, where the headhunters are going out and finding people. And what had happened was, because of the growth of the practice in the years during which the tech companies were creating a bubble, prior to that, we had hired 80% of our people off campus and 20% from the experienced workforce. Well, in order to support the kind of growth that we were experiencing, we had to have more experienced people more quickly. And so we reversed those statistics, and we started employing 80% of the people from the experienced workforce and 20% off campus. And what happened was the headhunters were bringing us men. They weren't bringing us women. So once we focused on that, we said, okay, wait a minute, time out. Candidates, candidates have to be diverse, and so you bring us women candidates as well as men candidates. Then you see the statistics begin to pick up again. But it does point out how closely you have to watch, even when things are going in the right direction. You get a change in circumstances, and all of a sudden you have a problem. So you have to pay attention. Well, the joke was they didn't believe it. We had been making roughly the same amount of money for a gazillion years, and it was and the thought was that you just couldn't do better than that. I mean, maybe it had been increasing for inflation or something, but the notion basically was that $250,000 a partner was about as good as maybe $300,000, but somewhere in that range was the glass ceiling. And I mean, we had our own consulting firm and other consulting firms saying the same thing. And I'm sitting there looking at law firms that make a lot more than that, and other organizations make a lot more than that, and I'm saying that's just nonsense. And so we designed this strategy, to change the business model and to make the firm more profitable. Laid it out in this strategy, and said, and of course the end slide says, okay, and here's the result of all of this stuff is that we're going to double our earnings per partner in the next 5 years. And they didn't believe it. They just laughed. They laughed out loud at me. So it was, and happily, we thought, as a management team, we thought it through pretty well. We were convinced it was absolutely doable. As long as the economy held, it was fairly easy to do, actually. So we got a lot of help from the volume growth in the economy, and we got a lot of help from the year 2000 issues, because the business community was panicked over their legacy systems that they had in place, and so we had done a great acquisition of an SAP based consulting firm, and we had some really, really wonderful people in our consulting practice, and they had put together these industry profiles so they could quickly install SAP software, or enterprise-wide software in a company with the benefit of this industry profile that had been done beforehand. So all of that just drove revenues in buckets, and so there was really no. It really wasn't very difficult to double the profitability in that period of time. That's one of the interesting things about the merger of Deloitte and Touche, because Touche Ross was basically a phenomena of post-Second World War. They began basically to build their practice after the Second World War, as did Andersen. Andersen was also a post-Second World War phenomena. The other big 8 firms had longer histories, and 2 of the longer historied firms were Pricewaterhouse and Deloitte. Consequently, most of the Fortune 500 clients were already locked up. Audit clients were already locked up by the other firms. So Touche Ross and Andersen basically built their practice by picking up the smaller, rapidly growing new clients, and by selling consulting services to the clients, to the audit clients of the other members of the Big Six. And Andersen went through a systems approach, and a systems consulting approach, and Touche Ross had built a terrific operations consulting group. And so they had come at it in different ways, but both of them had recognized that in the main the huge, big prestige clients were already locked up. So they needed to focus on what they could sell those clients that was not an audit, and perfectly sensible strategy for both of them. Our firm just ignored consulting in the main, and so we arrived at that period of time when consulting was such a wonderful opportunity, basically with no consulting firm. We had done a pretty nice job building a practice in Atlanta, I'll have to say, but most of the places in our firm we did not have a comparable practice to the big consulting practices, and Touche Ross had. So that was another reason they looked good to us as a merger partner, and we got another break in that Andersen by far owned the systems consulting practice, but they owned it on a custom design basis. And at about the time we completed and integrated the merger with Touche Ross, everybody started looking at what are referred to as enterprise-wide systems, where the software is already designed and written, and the company's procedures are changed to fit the software. Under what Andersen had done, they designed custom software to fit the procedures for the company. Much slower, much more expensive. So, big change. We did an acquisition of an SAP specialist firm that was led by a German. And that put us in the systems business, and we had all of these operational consultants already in place who could help the companies with the redesigning of their operations and procedures in order to fit the enterprise-wide system. So, we had a chance to leapfrog a huge advantage that Andersen had in that particular market. And of course, Andersen being a great firm, they quickly converted from a custom approach to specializing in enterprise-wide systems as well. But we had caught up. Not quite as large as they were, but we had a very, very competitive practice at that consulting practice at that point in time. So it's an interesting question, and it evolved in an interesting way. But during that period of time, I mentioned earlier that I thought our firm was just being out-competed, and that was part of it. They were much more strategic and intentional than we were. We were basically managing our practice in the 70s and the early 80s on a practice office basis. And so if you had a good managing partner who was aggressive and active in the market, you did fine in that area, but it wasn't cohesive. There was no national strategy, no national operations consistency. Yeah. So we just weren't really competitive with the best of the big 8, big 6, whatever, at that point in time. I would say it's not unusual. I think my case was extreme. You'll see that the more global a company is, and the more it is sort of, what's the best word, event-oriented. For example, an oil and gas CEO, I would say, has to do that, because you're not really managing a static operation at a place. You know, maybe you are if you have a refinery or something like that. But if you're trying to work out leases with a sovereign government in Venezuela or wherever else the oil and gas happens to be, there's no substitute for being there and being in front of them and negotiating the deal, and they want to see the leader. So, in that kind of a company, that would be the norm. I would say in the more stable businesses, it's more, you sort of have operations reviews that would be on a cycle basis, and you have event-driven appearances where something's going on that requires the leadership of the top guy in the organization. But in those kind of companies, I'd say they certainly are involved in international travel, but probably not to the same extent as as I was at that point in time. And had the integration of the global with the national practices been more mature and better developed, I would not have traveled as much. Again, it would have been probably limited more to operations reviews and things like that. But we were trying to get people to give up their own authority voluntarily, and that's a trust issue. Just not gonna happen without people knowing you, having confidence in you, and so you can't do that by telephone. It won't work. So you do what you need to do. My successor did a great job of that in China. We hadn't made the progress in China that we really needed to have made, and he focused on that. And I have no idea how many miles he burned between New York and Beijing or Shanghai. But he spent an enormous amount of time there and made great progress. And the position of our firm in China today is much stronger as a result of the time and effort that he spent there. It was much more around the strategic trust building kind of influence peddling, if you would, with your partners abroad, trying to get them to help you get done what you wanted to get done. And it was really important to know what you didn't know. For example, we had a strategy that we wanted to get implemented, but getting it implemented in Japan, I haven't got a clue. I have no idea how you get that done. So what I did was I went to my Japanese partners and said, this is our strategy, but I don't have a clue about how to do this in Japan. Tell me, help me. How do we get this done in Japan? They were wonderful partners, and so they had enormous cultural differences, and yet they were among the very best partners that we had, and they would find a way to make very difficult things happen in the Japanese marketplace, and I would never have done it, never been able to do it without relying on them to help me do it. And I think a lot of people that get involved in international enter into it initially with a lot more hubris than they ought to have, and so you you find out very rapidly how ignorant you are of the depth of knowledge that's required to really be effective in a national practice. And one of our German firm had encountered was involved in a fairly large lawsuit, and they were just panicked about it. And of course, U.S. partners were used to that. Take a number. We're every day was another lawsuit, and it's part of being part of the U.S. tort system. And they kept getting just more and more frantic about it, and I could not understand it. Could not understand why they were getting demanding and unreasonable. And these are really bright, wonderful professionals. And so I finally looked at our general counsel and I said, "We're going to Germany. we're gonna sit down and find out what we don't understand." And we went there and we listened to them talk for about 2 hours. And finally, one of them said, "You just don't understand." Said, "One of our partners can put us out of business tomorrow." And I said, "You're right. I don't understand. How can that happen?" And he said, "Well," he said, "under German law," he said, and given our organization structure, he says, if one of our partners reports to one of the regulators that we are insolvent and don't have the financial capacity to pay the claims under this lawsuit, they can put us out of business that day. And I looked at our general counsel and he looked at me and said, "Now we understand." We're going to panic too, because there's no replacement for our firm in Germany. So of course we solved it very quickly. We said, well, what if the global organization, member firms, were to stand good for, give you in essence a bond? And they said, well, that would deal with it. And so we did it. They I think they had no loss or a tiny loss in the settlement of the suit. But they were panicked, and they were panicked for a good reason. One that we didn't understand, because we didn't understand German law, and at least at the depth that we needed to. So, and that things like that occurred daily. There were issues that seemed to be irrational problems and never were. If you got bright, intelligent partners acting irrationally, you just don't understand. It isn't, it's not there's nothing wrong with them. It's the fact is you just don't understand what's going on there. And so countless times, we had this wonderful technology for auditing that we had invented, and it was a terrifically efficient tool. And so we wanted to embed it in the global practice, not just for the efficiency, but as you know, if you control the technology, you also control the methodology. And so that gave us a quality assurance tool. We could be sure that the methodology feeding the technology was sound and high quality, and gave us quality assurance. And one of our Southeast Asian firms just rebelled and said, "We're not going to do it. We aren't going to do it." We said, "Well, that's crazy. Why won't they do this? It's cost saving, and plus it gives us quality improvement." And so we finally said, "Okay, we got to sit down and talk with them, or something we don't understand." And we said, "Okay, why don't you want to put in AS2, adopt AS2 throughout your practice?" And they said, a computer, a laptop computer loaded with AS2 costs about $4,000. Said, and you say that that's an efficiency tool and will make us more efficient. Said, a new employee costs us $1,000 a year. so economically it was idiotic for them to agree to the. So we said, okay, we really want the quality improvement. How about if we subsidize you for the cost of the computers? And then of course immediately they're reasonable. But again, it's just a case of you don't understand the economics on the ground in a small Southeast Asian country, and so you have to be humble enough and have your ego under control enough to listen to smart people when they talk to you about something that they know a heck of a lot more about than you do, and you see people new in global jobs make those same mistakes over and over again. Well, I had great parents, and I grew up in a home where they gave me a religious and a spiritual foundation for the rest of my life, and it's driven my values for 65 years now, and I had a sense that businesses ought to give something back to the community. I also had wonderful role models in Atlanta. The business leadership were just superb civic leaders also. And one of the great things I missed about my work experience when I went to New York was that in Atlanta, if you were not a really, really rich person, you could still be a part of the leadership of the community if you would volunteer your time and effort. I can remember Larry Gellerstedt Jr. and Erskine Love putting their arm around me when I first started fooling United Way. I was a 37-year-old managing partner, and they said, "Don't." And I said, "Look, I just don't have the money to." And they said, "Don't worry about that." They said, "Just work." They said, "You'll have a seat at the table." And they said, "We got this strategic planning project for United Way. We want you to lead." And so that was how I got into it. And I think just seeing that very, very successful business leaders modeling that for you had a big influence, and it tied right into the value system that my parents and my faith had given me. So that was a pretty easy thing to decide to do for altruistic reasons. The surprise was that there was also a wonderful career learning experience in it that I never anticipated. And I look at that and say, gee, this is a lot like the same problems I have to deal with back at the office. Maybe if I can learn to deal with these successfully, I'll also be able to influence the people back in the office. And so it was just a wonderful training ground for leadership. And again, I had great role models. Oz Nelson, there was just tons of them.